Greetings from the More Pork channel, coming to you live from my captive state inside of the totalitarian democracy, predatory capitalism, free market chaos, empire, superpower, ruling the world, leading it off a cliff. That's what I'm going to discuss today. I just want to be on the historical record because I honestly think that eventually things will change. And my opinions are probably not that popular currently because wealth creation is one of the most vital things. And I've come up with a plan for the wealthy to evolve, and so that should give me credibility with them. But we live on a conflicted planet. I think we're heading towards a brick wall where eventually things are going to have to change, and they're going to keep the party going for as long as possible. Those when in control fear change. Change is a scary thing to a lot of people out there with power and money because they might actually have to justify their actions, and you see how history is being purged currently and being judged, which is, in my estimation, a dangerous precedent set, based on the current mob rule democracy, popular media driven popularity of the current age. And you're judging history by what you think others. The history was, there were different circumstances at different times. Everybody would act different at different times. Things change a lot. But from my lifetime, I've seen huge changes in how things are seen. It's just, and to judge history is a dangerous precedent. We have museums and zoos and things to try to. I'm more in favor of historic preservation, and rather than tearing down the. I think a lot of that's what's going on. The revolutionary media looks to undermine civilizations and nations in order to inflict their it goes back to this notion of competition, and I'm going to discuss competition in a lot of aspects. Competition is the underlying sentiment to everything in life because we live by this capitalist system of economy, and I think and the thing I think that's going to change is the notion of growth as being the positive and shrinkage, recession being a negative aspect. When you look at, we're at 8 billion people on the planet with limited resources and out of control, spiraling ball of chaos. So we have live in a conflicted planet, extreme competition, ruled by this notion of totalitarian democracy trying to free all the people of the world, but in actuality, they're just trying. I think there are some nefarious motives to freeing people. When you free people, it undermines those that are in power. So therefore, you gain masterdom over those in power, and you gain masterdom over the nation because they control the nation. So I think a lot of this altruistic spreading of totalitarian democracy and freedom is a way of actually a belligerent motive. They're trying to take over the country by using, and I started working on a book that I want to compile. I call it SunZoo's The Art of Modern War. See the voice thing still hanging around. Modern war being using economics and the media are two of the most prevalent weapons in the arsenal these days. corporate war machines, and the media uses idols and all of this stuff, and trying to mutate and brainwash societies to change in order to gain a masterdom over them, and then in actuality seize control of the power structure of the countries. And I think that's a lot of what's going on now. And that a lot of it is seen as altruism, or we're the good guys here trying to save the world from the horrific fate. And I admit there's been some atrocities in the past, but I honestly believe in alternative leaderships with checks and balances, and I think that democracy has a huge flaws, and they're proving it with the global debt crisis, the party system. I think the United States is literally an insane country, and I've made a strong case as to that. And they're the superpower steering the planet, and they are literally insane, fighting a civil war between two bipolar extreme polar opposites that hate each other, and they're never going to agree, and they have a massive problem with the I'm going to skip ahead with the debt being at $32 trillion, and people and the media keeps the masses hypnotized, keep the party going. They don't really want to ask the hard-hitting questions, and they're worried about raising the debt ceiling. But the debt, all they're fighting over right now is capping spending. They're not actually talking about a balanced budget. The total tax revenue for the United States is 4.9 trillion. The total spending for the United States is 6.9 trillion. So they're running a $2 trillion a year deficit almost. The interest on the debt, 32 trillion, is about almost $1 trillion a year. So you factor in $1 trillion into 4.9 trillion, and they will have to raise taxes. And that's what the Republicans are going to fight over. Eventually, they're going to have to raise taxes, and they're going to have to cut spending. That's the only way they can balance the budget. It's inevitable, and they're just putting it off, making the problem worse and worse for future generations who are really getting screwed by these Playboy politicians who are going to be laughing from their graves when the debt is crippling future generations' ability to govern and lead and plan and do things, which might lead to a revolution, potentially. I think there's several. The AI might lead to a revolution also, because it's going to take a lot of human jobs, and it's going to render human life inconsequential. And so I think you might see, and that's all based on profit maximization of capitalism. So I think when profit maximization capitalism is taking out of the loop, human lives will be back into, I think that you could see a revolution on that aspect. And once AI, so that's another big potential problem. But so you've got these political parties fighting over capping spending. And that's all this big brouhaha, this horrific nature. And they're not even talking about balancing the budget or paying off the principal of $32 trillion. Not to mention, personal debt just reached $17 trillion. So there's also that. Then you got state debt, municipal debt, unfunded liabilities such as Medicare and Social Security in the future, which are huge. I mean, it's just it's a nightmare. Then you factor in the global debt of supposedly, and that's who knows the actual number. I've seen anywhere from 240 trillion to 300 trillion. So it weakens a lot of nations, and the globe has no real leadership because they're allowing the superpowers to exploit the countries economically to gain an advantage so they can inflict their masterdom over these nations through economic corporate war machine belligerence. And it's a horrific nightmare, but the media covers it all up because the United States is winning. And the global media follows the United States media because they're the free press, but they're actually revolutionary. They're trying to undermine I've concocted that there's a secret war going on in the United States against Europe because Europe has old deep blood in the United States in royalty and aristocracy, and the United States is cash is king, and they have and so they're fighting for what is what system is dominant, and they are that's part of the problem in competition when it's stuck in a system that has weakness um, or underlying faults. You have to kill the competition. So because the United States, not to mention they have a massive inferiority complex, and I recently wrote somebody stating that the United States is kind of like artificial intelligence. If you want to see what artificial intelligence looks like, it was made up of parts. Artificial intelligence is made up of a compilation of all intelligence of the world being fed into this computer system and then analyzing it, learning to think. The United States is an amalgamation of all of these other nations, and then it created this massive university system giving it R&D advantages, and it's got an inferiority complex over its source of where they came from, and so they're trying to that's where the secret war on Europe comes in. And so the AI, the United States has taken over the world basically using King God dollar as the currency of it, as the currency to dominate trade, and it parades it around under the banner of democracy and freedom when it's really an oppressive regime trying to take over the world through economic belligerence and revolutionary media undermining historic civilizations in order to gain masterdom over them in this theoretical estimation. And so it's a very belligerent nation, but it uses this covert nocturnal 50 stars in the dark covert nocturnal secret wars to undermine nations and seize control through various ways. That's where my book, The SunZoo's Art of Modern War, comes in and starts identifying all of these things. And I'm blacklisted by the talent agents and by publishers. And I would really like some help writing that one. I've got a lot of notes on it on Twitter, just because there's a real possibility that I could get murdered because of my beliefs, and I pose a threat. And so I post everything I write online in order to preservationism, historic preservationism, even though there's a war to try to erase me from history theoretically, but hopefully that won't happen. I would like to gain some notoriety before I die. But so I skipped around. The debt crisis, which is propagated by this totalitarian democracy, and I'm calling for alternative leadership. And there's all sorts of examples, but democracy doesn't like competition, even though they worship a competitive system. Because there are flaws in it. It's mob rule, swarms, herds, stampedes. The media manipulates them, and that's why I say the media is revolutionary, because they manipulate the mob to destroy as a weapon of mass destruction, especially globally if they disagree. So it's either agree with our ideology or we will destroy you with our media air force and our economic war machines and seize control of your nation. And that's just a bad example to set. And it all goes back to there's no overt total leadership, planetary plan. And there really needs to be. And I know those in charge do not want another entity of leadership, but it's an inevitability. Like I said, we're heading to a brick wall when we decide population growth is a dangerous thing. We need to figure out something. And especially I'm thinking in 100-year perspective here. You got to start thinking it's always current, present, what's going on in the current present time. But most people, or 4 more years for politicians, but nobody's thinking in 100 years. And I've seen the population growth projections over the next 100 years, and it's going to be a nightmare. So there's going to have to be some major changes, or the face of the earth will be completely reworked. And I'm, like I said, for historic preservation. And I think we need to preserve the nations in a somewhat sort of perspective of how trying to preserve history, basically, rather than making it an amalgamated mess because of this party rule, totalitarian democracy prevalence. So the ideas that I had dealing with the debt, and the debt crisis is the $300 trillion debt crisis is horrific globally. And I think most economists are only worried about short term. They're not looking at the long term. They have to realize that that's a much bigger problem than the toxic asset bubble that burst in 2008. I think we're looking at a huge recession or global depression. And I think there are certain factions that are playing into it. Those with the resources to, it's going to be a buying frenzy for those with the most money. And the United States has the most money because it's charged out. It's built this economic war machines, and it's charged out to this lead where it controls 25% of the global GDP. So if there is and the United States is a superpower, so if there is, as I predict, a massive global recession or depression, whenever they decide to turn on the lights and say, hey, we've got a real debt issue here we need to solve, then it's going to create a buying opportunity for those with the resources. And I'm working on a book. I've written one book called Fleur de Lis about New Orleans high society and an oil heir. In the second book, he's going to create a campaign to be Caesar of Louisiana. In the third book, though, and he's also involved in Ski Resort TV, which acclimates him to a bunch of the world's wealthy throughout the globe. But in the third book that I'm planning, I have this plan where a coalition of wealth, and we're talking about super wealthy here, but it could be a coalition of wealthy, and we're talking about a big number here. And this is all, I'm still taking down ideas of how, I don't know exactly how I'll write it, but a coalition of wealthy will interview nations, and nations will be begging to be bought by this coalition of wealthy because they could turn them into an economic world power. And so they would buy this nation, install a capitalist party system, and the capitalist party could be set up like a corporation or a country club, where you, depending on how much money you invested in the purchase of the nation, as to how many shares you have in this capitalist party and how much voting percentage rights you have. And so there would have to be a negotiation as to control of the government once you buy this nation. And the people would just have to, and this would be a global example. So there would be a lot of scrutiny on this. So, but in my estimation, they would turn it into this utopian type society that could be the best country in the world. They would have the resources to they could bring in divisions of the corporations that they own into this country to provide high paying jobs. So you could turn a country like I saw a show recently. There's a bunch of nations, small nations, and it wouldn't take a huge nation. Um, but because we're talking about, I don't even know how many, I haven't even put together the numbers, how many wealthy, but we definitely would need some of the super wealthy involved because it would take billions and they would have to invest billions into this. And but it would have the potential to be like investing in a business because you would create a nation that would provide safety and security, privatized security force. They could buy their own army, and then you build cities in this nation, these modern smart cities, like they're doing, like Dubai, and they're doing in different parts of the world. These Singapore's building some smart cities, and you bring in all these jobs, and so the population would be infused into this. And then all the countries that were surrounding this nation, it would be like the monolith in 2001. This nation would be to evolve the entire region, hopefully surrounding. That's my idea for the book, at least. And I could take it in any number of directions, but it has real historic ramifications. And it's amazing that I'm still blacklisted and can't sell it because that's a really good idea. It's really original. And I could put a lot of ideas for changing society, but that gets away from totalitarian democracy. And so I'm sure the revolutionary media will fight against it being unfair to the people who lose control of their nation. But if they're taken care of, and they have provided, and they would still be there would be several layers of government involved. So there would still be a democracy for the population to elect leaders, but they just wouldn't have the nationalistic power that the capitalist party would reign over the nation in order for their best interests to turn it into a economic superpower. And with all the money and resources and wealth, they could start pulling investments and banking and things like that. So and just turned it into a utopian sort of society, this real advanced nation. And so that's one of the ideas that I had. And because of the global debt catastrophe, a lot of nations who are going to be having trouble because they don't have the economic base to pay off these debts, it might make them susceptible to being bought by this conglomeration. And there would have to be all sorts of deals worked out. And this would have to be okayed with Interpol and the United Nations and things like that. But I don't see it being a problem. Because it's not like an oppressive regime or anything like that. So we're talking about a utopian society here potentially. So it's just an alternative form of leadership, this capitalist party based on coalition of wealth. So that's one of my ideas. And the debt catastrophe could lead to opportunities for these nations. So you could take a nation with a lot of debt that needed economic growth in order to pay off the debt, and this would be a way to grow the economy massively. And so I think the nations would be lining up to say, yeah, we would love to be a part of this deal. And there's all sorts of intangible potential problems, but still, it's a utopian sort of idea, alternative leadership. Not to mention the Caesar of Louisiana has checks and balances. I've come up with a whole list of campaign agendas, such as making aristocracy to basically be able to. The free markets neglect a lot of the state because and so with these title aristocracy having spread out throughout the entire state, there would be a competition throughout them utilizing wealth management resources. That I've come up with an idea of pooling state aristocracy wealth management resources in order to create investments. And so I've got my idea is really interesting. And if Louisiana does nothing, it's going to be mediocrity at best with a strong sports program and a bunch of parties. But it could be a world leader and with my plan. So, I'm offering options. At least somebody out there is thinking, and I've come up with options. So that's book 2. Um, Options and alternative leadership. The mob rule democracy is inherently flawed. The craziness of the party system is really, and this is where the debt is a symptom of the craziness of the party system. This mob rule camaraderie, drunk camaraderie. Anytime you get a camaraderie, a group together, you can facilitate they're drunk with power. And that's one of the big problems with the bipolar United States system is they're drunk with power and it's turned them crazy because of the extreme hate. The United States is too diverse, and now they're turning Europe into a misery loves company. And this was a funny thing that I discovered. Midland Lutheran College Warriors, Fremont was from Savannah. And Midland is where the Bushes lived when right after he ran the CIA. And so was this a secret CIA war mission to infiltrate Misery Loves Company, Midland Lutheran College, Fremont, Savannah? That's why I'm stuck here when they have Elba natural gas. I'm exiled here. Napoleonic Code. Louisiana was sabotaged, no doubt about it, and I was seen as a threat because for my name basically, and so Marxism, semiotic, signage, entertainment, Jungian synchronicity. So I was sabotaged and I'm captive. And where was I going with this? Oh, so this other Midland, so Europe basically, the Yankee media was pressing melting pot and diversity. And so Europe took it to heart and the European media took over the cause. And now Europe is now and you have to look at all the numbers, but basically, if you look at this from a SunZoo's Art of Modern War context, the United Kingdom has surrendered London to the migrant armies because of the gaming of democracy vulnerabilities. Democracy is vulnerable to migration because it changes the demographic output. So no longer is United Kingdom the traditional genetic people of United Kingdom are a minority in the city of London. I think it's like 35% is what I've read, and the rest are from other countries. And so they control London, which is like surrendering. And it's a beautiful thing in some aspects, but when you look at it realistically, they'll never gain control of that city again. And unless some things change, they've lost control of their capital city, basically. And it's a huge strategic flaw, even though this party mentality, this kumbaya that that's one of the ways the revolutionary media works is by creating problems through diversity, and then they incite rebellion from these minorities to undermine the foundations of civilization nations. That's a revolutionary media in my estimation. And these are poor, struggling people, but they are weapons of the gaming of the democracy. They're an army because they mutate the face of the nation from its traditional heritage. So you're not, it's not preserving history in my estimation. So that is one of the ways that totalitarian democracy that's one of the weaknesses in it is, and especially in a country where there is no leadership. And I have a plan if there was a global leadership governance that would tax the GDP of the top half of nations and then help the bottom half of nations through economic incubator stabilization development ways so they wouldn't, and I think that there should be an international global army military that could handle a lot of the problems, because right now the current leadership basically says anytime there's a problem, send them to Europe. Europe is going to be a totally different place from what it was in 20 to 100 years. And they're drunk on their party mob mentality, this totalitarian democracy. And I think the United States just goes back into this misery loves company, secret CIA, that's a joke, but it has a real, when you look at it as being competitive, um, because Europe has deep blood and genetic matters, and United States artificial intelligence has diversity made up of the genetics of these other nations, and they're fighting for in the United States are now they are supersized. They've supersized their citizenry because they're worth 25% of. So they were fighting. It was a competition. Was there an actual secret plan to infuse Europe with migration in order to prevent medicine against the potential of changing the economic structure, economic ideology globally? Because most of the world has deep blood. The United States is a melting pot. So by turning Europe into a melting pot, it justifies the melting pot system and it validates it. And so therefore, was there a secret plan? That all goes back to my book on Sun Tzu's Art of War. But back to this youth generation getting screwed by Playboy politicians, hypnotized by the media. It's their self-absorbed narcissism because they're in the early infancy stages of social media. We had internet for a while, that was a real rising sun, but now that these social media sites are so prevalent, and then they are so individualistic, they create sacred individuals. And I think that sacred individualism, especially when you've got AI coming up to take all the jobs, especially, and CNBC said white collar jobs are going to be taking over because competition, capitalism, profit maximization. So you're going to have companies out there creating AI software that will do the jobs of a lot of white collar workers. So that's a lot of your high paying jobs. So there's profit maximization, justification, profitability for getting AI to take over. So you're going to see a lowering of the standard. So they're actually AI technology is actually devaluing in the future, potentially leading to a humanistic revolution. But against capitalism because of profit maximization, and then therefore, I lost my train of thought there. So that's just one of the other ramblings. Global debt coalition of wealth. Okay, let's go back to that. Planetary evolution is vital, and I wrote a whole book about it. Electronic Oblivion is about a global awakening, and when I say awakening, I mean an elevated consciousness and leadership. There is no planetary leadership right now. We've got superpower, we've got competition. Capitalism is our god because these business profit maximization determines where the next planet goes. It's all about what's profitable, who has money to buy up the assets created from these. And so capitalism is the overt leadership of and that's not good because there's no planetary guidance and nobody's solving the planetary problems. Sure, there's the super wealthy are altruistic and they do good, but with a global planetary leadership, they could actually solve most of the problems. There's no reason to have the problems that we have globally with hunger and just all these. They should be, we're smart enough people. We have smartphones. We're smart enough to build smartphones, but we can't solve these problems in these depressed nations. So there, and it's because of a lack of planetary leadership. It's because we allow capitalism to be our leader, and free market chaos reigns. And so it determines the future of the planet. There's no plan in place for the planet. So I called for years ago a supreme evolutionary council made up of the great minds of the world to look at the 100-year plans that, for the future. And I think that's a prime example. I wrote a novel around 2000, around the time of the millennium when the religion wackos hijacked the millennium, and then Jesus freaks came in and took over, and they don't want change. They want people to be small-minded, easily to manipulate and control, the same as the political parties do. So the political parties and the religious fanatics are working together to keep people small-minded, blind, in the dark, easily to manipulate and control, while the revolutionary media tells them what to think and what to do. And this global awakening is a threat to that, because it would reveal the nefariousness of the previous decades of how it's been going on, what's been going on, and the problems that it's created. And it would also, but it's necessary to solve the definite problems. So this book I wrote around 2000, around when we should have had a global evolutionary leap forward, and rather than regressing back into antiquated religious texts and just to keep the party raging, is that there was a global government formed that had a evolutionary supreme council. It had its own spy agency. It had its own military. And I suggested that the United Nations vote. The United States has a military the size of the next 9 nations. So the United Nations, out of fear of world war, could vote to see 75%. I've been bantering that around. Still leave the United States with the largest military in the world, just not with a huge advantage. And there would be no necessity for the United States, who is steering the planet poorly, and just to exploit economically, in my estimation, and try to gain masterdom over these nations. They're using this nefarious methods of chicanery to try to gain masterdom over nations rather than military war, which they condemn, even though they have a massive military. So the United Nations gets a military. I actually think we need to redo the whole global government thing. The United Nations is, I think there's probably too many embedded problems in there. Then there was a spy agency and a military, an evolutionary supreme council, and an economic development branch, which would take the resources, because the United Nations doesn't have the money to accomplish what it needs to accomplish and solve the problems of the world. But this new global government could tax the GDP and have a tax base and be able to actually solve the problems. You're going to have to fund them. They're going to have to be funded, and the only way to do it is through taxing these nations. They tax all its citizens, and let the nations be taxed now. And it transfers power to a central branch, and there's, I'm sure there will be a huge discussion over the leadership parameters. I think Switzerland's has got a good example of a council of seven, a federal council of seven, and they get a new president every year. That way, that seems real fair. And but political parties are a huge problem right now. It's mob rule, drunk mob rule, inflicting its power, and so I'm sure that that needs to be addressed. But one of my ideas was if you were an officer in the military or an officer in the intelligence corps, that you could get a global passport that would allow you to live in any country as a perk, and that's that way. I see that's a small number of people compare moving to that way. It's kind of, and not to mention you solve a lot of the problems of the world. So I don't think you'd see this mass upheaval, mutation of nations. Nations are mutating. They're getting plastic surgery, genetic plastic surgery from the revolutionary media in order to try to create divisiveness and create future. I honestly think this plan, I caught this plan early. I think 20 to 100 years, Europe is gonna, if it keeps going and the same mentality perseveres, and I think they'll eventually hit a brick wall and say we've just had enough, because when it's 50% migrants, 50% of the traditional nation population, and then it's going to be us and them, the old Pink Floyd song. They'll be fighting for control. They'll have to fight for control of their nation. So they game democracy can be gamed. It is because and democracy leads to gaming the vulnerability. There are vulnerabilities in democracy, and we're seeing that throughout the planet. And so that's another detriment to democracy, not to mention the insanity it breeds through political parties. So, those are the planetary evolution is a mentality of an awakening to a planetary goal. And I think we need this planetary council comes up with these goals. And I think space exploration is obvious. I called for a spaceport being built, which is like a space station, but a lot bigger. I think we need to redo the space shuttle so we can bring bigger space shuttles, so we can bring tonnage into space and really build a huge spaceport and really try to have a 500,000, 10,000 people living in space at one time. And then once we have a footing in space, we can start launching ships from, we keep ships in space. I think that's probably what will end up being seen as I agree. We need to go back to the moon. It would be nice to have a base on the moon, but a spaceport orbiting the planet that was a lot bigger and a lot more substantial. It was actually like a city in space would be an evolutionary step and lead to the going to Mars and things like that in the next step forward, thinking 100 years down the line. But there is no planetary leadership. We're allowing the free market to determine that. And thankfully, we have people like Elon Musk and SpaceX and Jeff Bezos and Amazon and Blue Origin and things like that that are Richard Branson and that are thinking with space. And of course, the United States is trying to militarize it to conquer it and be the global dominating master. The secret mask that the United States wears and the media hype machine beautician that it has to cover up its covert global domination aspirations is a joke. And I think that's one of the reasons that I am blacklisted and cloistered and alienated is because of global awakening is a change, and it would point out a lot of the foibles in the system itself. But I think what we're going to need to address is, and I'm going to skip ahead, that's enough on planetary evolution, Spring Council, global goals for the next 100 years, identify problems of the next 100 years, natural resources, obviously. And the more people we have, the more pollution we have, the more natural resources we need. So population control in the next 100 years. Not to mention, if you got the same, if you keep perpetuating the status quo, you're going to see Europe is going to have a total, Europe will probably be majority Muslim and African in 100 years if the things go. And if I go to Europe, I don't want to go to, I can go to Africa or I can go to the Middle East, and I want to go to see French people or Italian people or English people or German people. You know, I don't want to go and to a melting pot. The United States should be the example of the rule, in my estimation. But since there is no planetary leadership, the planetary leadership is send them to Europe if there's a problem. Let's ruin one of our best assets, or not ruin it, but basically let's mutate it, or they're going to have future problems. Huge. It's going to be like the United States with crime, in my estimation, and class warfare, not to mention racial. You see how much the media is trying to brainwash people to live diversity. Diversity is a difficult thing to sell, especially when you're trying to go so far extreme left. So I think that the United States ought to be proof as to the dangers of diversity. And so Europe is behind the United States, but in another 20 to 100 years, you're going to have empowered, entrenched minorities fighting, and not to mention they're going to want to seize control of the assets, because it'll be a class warfare struggle. So rather than being just, they'll get tired of doing, oh, it's great when you come from extreme, the same way with you come from extreme poverty and famine, and you get to an area, or war, and you get to an area that has the jobs you get, but you get tired, you acclimate to the system. So eventually these minority factions, or potentially majority if it keeps going, will rise up, and the United States media will most certainly incite rebellion to undermine Europe, because of competition is war, and they're a different type of system than we are. They have an advantage. They had an advantage if they the game changer advantage that could have rendered the United States an inferior system economically and societally. But this misery loves company, Midland Lutheran College warriors saw that. That was the Bush CIA secret war on Europe. If that was true, I would be shocked. But it's got the semiotics there. So, chaos rule of free markets. That goes back to the chaos rule of the planet. The planet is steered by chaos. There is no, I think we need to implant some sort of control mechanism, some sort of steering. We're out of control. We're an avalanche going downhill, destroying everything in its path. Cash is king creates problems. This note, that goes back to the whole notion. And I'm for prosperity and growth, but growth as a a necessity is going to hit a brick wall. Eventually, you're going to have to say, we've got enough. This goes back to greed being the root of all evil. Greed, you need more. And there are underclasses who you're trying to elevate. But the problem is, the majority of wealth still goes to the top 10%. All this wealth that was created, and the biggest wealth creation in history because of quantitative easing, 2010 to 2020, the most wealth created in the history of the world. But most of it went to the top 10%. The majority of it did. They gained, and so they've got a system in place. It goes back to maximum returns on investment and things like that. And so cash is king creates a problem. There needs to be, and this goes back to the difference between Europe, which has actual kings and royalty and aristocracy and land titles and things like that, which they haven't had to work for. They did their hard work years ago. What I'm trying to do in Louisiana is, and the aristocracy would actually have to work and build the state up. And then they could rest on their laurels and probably get fat and lazy. But once the state was developed, Europe is a far more advanced state. But now Europe is facing the threat of having to grow or be bought. That's the other problem. If you don't grow, if you don't race the United States, they will buy you. They print up a ton of monopoly, Parker Brothers monopoly money. They print up a ton of money and they can buy anything. And eventually they might pay a lot for it, but that takes away economic growth. When you go to Shark Tank is great. If you're allowing, if that's actually happening. And you allow there still to be similar, but for the most part, I think of what's happening is mergers and acquisitions like American Psycho, where they just go in, throw a lot of money at it, take over the project, then develop it. So if you've got a good idea and you're in a country that's underdeveloped, and this idea could turn into a $1 billion corporation that could employ 10,000 or 100,000 people in your country. But they're scouring, they're smart enough to know what a good idea is. And they have enough money and resources to send out the farm team to scout the best ideas in the world. When they see a good idea, they buy up the idea and then take the idea back to America, then turn it into a $1 billion company. And so you've created some wealth there. Sure, they paid $100 million for it, or they paid $10 million for it, or however much, because they have unlimited resources. But it's bad for the country itself because it misses out. It's opportunity cost or opportunity loss. It's an opportunity loss to create and that goes back to competition being dangerous, because then again, they could be competed out of the whole thing and lose out on it. So it goes back to economies of scale. And this goes back to this growth model. And this is why the United States is a growth demon. It has grown to the point of being too big to fail, and that's one of the reasons I think QE was enacted during when it was, is because of when the technological boom. QE helped a lot of these massive technology companies, and they're behemoths who are the United States sees as United States entities, unless they decide to buy a country, like I suggested earlier. But it goes back to this whole notion of these countries are not being developed purposely, and the gaps. And it goes back to the gaps between the haves and the have-nots. And when you look at society, the rich and the poor are one thing, but nations and that's what they're trying to instill in the world. And that's what they've instilled in the world. There's the nations of the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots, a lot of the lower are just in horrific states of affairs. So I think that's where you need the government, the global government, to come in and with this economic development team, find ways to grow them up and develop up. And incubators are ways for nations to build industries and build infrastructure, in economic infrastructure, in order to grow to a sustainable level. Because otherwise, it's going to be the haves and the have-nots, which is very unfair globally, and potentially, whenever the planet turns globally into a global democracy, which is inevitable, you might see a revolutionary sentiment. So you solve the problem and you put out a fire potentially of this problem. So chaos rule of free markets are steering the planet. The revolutionary free press put pressure on alternative leadership turning. Oh, this was another thing that I see a problem in. And the revolutionary free press sees democracy as the only option. There are other types of leadership out there. But because of the pressure to create revolution, because they are instilling revolution in these, without the revolutionary free press trying to overthrow nations to free its citizens so they can be exploited by the United States system of economic warfare and conquered by cowboy brands and branded to be processed. These nations are forced to inflict these horrific authoritative regime sort of, because they're trying to create, because they want to there's revolution being thrust upon them, they're forced to clamp down. So, in my estimation, not all kings are evil, and not all Caesars or emperors or premiers or whatever. There are ways, and democracy has shown flaws in my estimation. And in my Rise of the Caesar, I put it as a checks and balances. There's still the politics should be the utilitarian control or operation of the state. But the Caesar would then have power over the wealthy, because there would be title and an evolutionary conference, which would help steer the state. And these are all utopian sorts of ways of adding different dimensions of leaderships to form checks and balances, because there is no one steering. And I use Louisiana as an example because I know it best. Right now, Louisiana is a pawn. It is manipulated by the national political parties. And the political parties are in control of the state. The political parties will not bring in economic development. They do not have a plan for the future. They do not care about Louisiana, even though they pretend to by promoting certain leaders. But there is no leadership in Louisiana right now. There needs to be leadership. But democracy mob rule does not formulate a plan for the future. It's 4 more years. We want there, and they keep flip-flop, and now they've gotten to the back and forth, and they don't really have any future agendas, and they don't care about the future because they're screwing the youth of America with tax burden that's going to cripple the future. And they don't care. All they care about is present potency, present potency. They want to be seen as potent and keep the party raging while they're in. And if they really cared about the nation, or they really cared about their kids and the youth of the nation, they would balance the budget, pay off the principal, formulate a plan for the future. But they don't care. And all they care about is 4 more years, present, potent. They want to be seen as potent in the present. And even though there's these huge problems, in forms, especially in competitive regions. Yeah, democracy within a competitive region, it really creates this predatory nature. And I keep harping on this on Twitter that the competition has mutated predatory, and it goes back to several reasons. First of all, the media hype machine is instilled this sacred individualism. Individuals are not sacred. It's the most common resource on the planet, basically. But because of personal injury lawyers, and if you get hurt, you're worth something. You're worth $100 million. Or if you can trophy hunt, if you touch somebody with money and you can find a way to sue them in frivolous lawsuits, that makes you worth something. So in that aspect, they're worth something. If you get screwed or if you get hurt or personal injury law makes you worth something. You can possibly get into the game and you're worth so much you're not that you would attack. That it creates this predatory nature of attacking everything, and this predatory nature is especially when you have the most resources on the planet that you start attacking. So, and I call for economic war in my SunZoo's Art of War book is a big prevalent thing. These corporate war machines and one of the things I would really like to do if I ever had my own foundation or resources or anything like that, a team, and I wrote this to The Economist recently on Twitter, put together every nation should have a fingerprint of every overseas aggression or if every brand that is sold overseas is manufactured in the United States should be on a map. Every mergers and acquisitions of any assets by any corporation should be on the map. And just any economic advancement into another nation should be on the map. And I know what would happen. The United States fears this because the United States looks like a totalitarian dictatorship trying to take over the world economically. And it goes back to this chaos. They have all these resources. They have a massive inferiority complex. And this is what artificial intelligence would look like, in my estimation, when the United States gained massive intelligence through this massive university system. And they have the tools now, and they have the economic war machines. And eventually, AI could have the tools and the economic war machines, especially with the advent of robots coming about. So you really could see this rise of robots and rise of artificial intelligence seizing control once they gain any sort of higher intelligence, like the United States, which is a sum of parts of the rest of the world, but it has taken over the world using the King got dollars. It's the currency of exchange. I think we ought to have a global dollar or a global currency because it's an unfair advantage and it sets a precedence, and not to mention economies of scale in taking over this nation. It's very predatory. And this goes back to superpowers steering the planet poorly to exploit economically. That's what's going on now. China is fighting back because the United States has such a huge lead. Would China back off there? Is China evolved enough intellectually to coexist on the planet without being aggressive, like the communists of the past were? That is the question. And it's a shame that Russia proved its belligerence, even though economic war is much more destructive. No, I don't know, I'm going to say much more destructive, but is a bigger problem globally, economic war, than military war. So Russia at a bad time invaded Ukraine. And So the question is democracy and competition. Democracy sees other forms of leadership as competition, so it will try to squash them using, and the revolutionary free press media wants to free people so they can be enslaved economically and be utilized like batteries in the Matrix. And that scene where you had everybody plugged in. That's what the revolutionary free press. They want everybody to be a feeding pod to fuel the system, which is going to hit a brick wall eventually because I don't understand the revolutionary free press's obsession with consumerism. I guess it goes back to commercials being paying for their in that programming them. But the problem that we have is totalitarian democracy and competition steering the planet. Competition and free market chaos steering the planet rather than a global entity actually in control, planning for the future with solving the problems that are obviously have been problems for a long time, and the superpower steering haven't solved them. So I've been going an hour, and my voice held out good this time. I think I've covered most everything. That will cover it for today. So let's hope I can escape my notoriety. And eventually, I think somebody might listen to these one day. Who knows? It's possible. Y'all have a lovely evening.